July 1942, North Africa. The night was so dark that even the stars looked afraid to shine. A thin line of jeeps, engines muffled, headlights covered, weapons bristling, crawled across the Libyan desert like a pack of hunting wolves. At the lead, gripping the wheel with knuckles bleached white from tension, sat a broad-shouldered Irishman with eyes that had seen too many fights to fear another. His name was Robert Blair, Paddy Mayne, boxer, rugby legend, lawyer. And now, the most dangerous man in the British Special Air Service. Behind him, strapped to the jeeps, were Vickers K machine guns. In front of him, hidden beyond the dunes, were dozens of German aircraft, lined up wingtip to wingtip on a Luftwaffe airfield near Benghazi. Mayne tapped his watch. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The men watching him already knew what that silence meant. This wasn't a raid. This was an execution. He raised his fist. Jeeps halted. Engines coughed, then died. The desert swallowed the noise. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no wind, no breath. Then Mayne whispered, "Right, let's go kill some airplanes." The jeeps roared to life. Machine guns opened up. Tracers sliced through the darkness. And German aircraft, Messerschmitts, Junkers bombers, Heinkel transports, erupted into fire one after another like a string of igniting fuses stretching across the desert floor. Within minutes, Paddy Mayne had destroyed more enemy aircraft in a single raid than some fighter squadrons managed in a month. And this was only the beginning. They drove straight into the enemy's throat. The Luftwaffe airfield should have been silent, a sleeping giant under the African moon. Instead, it erupted into chaos the moment Paddy Mayne's SAS jeeps burst through the perimeter wire, engines howling, sand exploding beneath their tires. German guards shouted, scrambling for rifles. Searchlights snapped on, slicing white beams across the runways. But it was already too late. Mayne's Vickers K guns, the same ones mounted on British fighter planes, sprayed fire in sweeping arcs. Their rate of fire shredded canvases, fuel lines, wing roots, and cockpit glass as if the aircraft were made of paper. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 ignited in one massive bloom of flame. Then a Junkers 52 began burning nose to tail, turning the fuselage into a torch. A row of Stukas went up next, their distinctive gull wings silhouetted in blistering heat. "Keep moving!" Mayne barked. His voice didn't crack with adrenaline. It was steady, almost bored, the tone of a man who had found his true element. The jeeps weaved between parked aircraft, the men firing nonstop. Every burst felt like a hammer blow to the German war machine. A flare rose from the far side of the airfield. Tracer fire answered back. Luftwaffe gunners scrambled into position, but the darkness worked against them. They fired too high, too late, at shadows that vanished before their guns settled. Mayne swung his jeep around a burning bomber, sparks flying over his boots. "Next row!" he yelled. They tore down another lane of aircraft, ripping through Heinkels lined up for a dawn sortie. One by one they exploded, ammunition cooking off, metal shrieking as wings collapsed. And in the center of it all, Paddy Mayne stood like a man performing a grim, familiar ritual, destroying the enemy on their own runway with a ruthlessness the Axis never expected from men in desert khakis. Hours earlier, back at the SAS camp, one of the new recruits had asked him how many aircraft he thought they'd hit tonight. Mayne had shrugged. Enough to make Rommel feel lonely. He wasn't joking, because by this point in the war, Paddy Mayne had already become something whispered about in German briefing rooms. A phantom of the desert, a raider who attacked places no sane commander believed were vulnerable. His weapon wasn't just the Vickers gun. It was unpredictability. He moved like weather, struck like lightning, and vanished before anyone could understand what had happened. As the raid intensified, German officers finally organized a defense. Machine gun nests opened up. Tracer rounds ripped through the air. A searchlight caught the back row of jeeps, illuminating them like insects pinned under glass. Mayne reacted instantly. "Cut it down!" 2 Vickers guns turned and unleashed hell. The searchlight shattered. The gun crew behind it scattered or fell. "Paddy, "We can't stay long," one of his men shouted over the roar. Mayne looked across the burning field, wing fragments glowing red, chunks of fuselage raining down, explosions blooming one after another. They'd been on the ground for just 7 minutes. 7 minutes, and more than 20 enemy aircraft were already burning. He checked his watch again. "We're not done yet." He gunned the engine and headed straight toward the far hangars, the place where the Luftwaffe kept the aircraft they couldn't afford to lose. Recon photos had shown at least a dozen intact fighters hidden inside. Perfect. He slid the Jeep sideways, tires screaming, and jumped out before it fully stopped. "Cover me!" His men opened fire as Paddy sprinted across open ground. Bullets snapped past him. White-hot tracers stitched the sand at his heels. He didn't slow. He grabbed a satchel charge from his belt, pulled the pin, and hurled it into the hangar. A split second of silence, then an eruption so violent it knocked him to one knee. The hangar roof lifted like a kicked tin can. A dozen aircraft inside were reduced to twisted skeletons in a heartbeat. He wiped soot from his face, stood and signaled for the jeeps. "Next hangar." Even his own men stared at him with disbelief. Paddy Mayne wasn't just fearless, he was unstoppable, but not everything went smoothly. As they turned toward the western runway, a hidden German machine gun nest opened fire from behind sandbags. The first burst tore the wing mirror off Mayne's Jeep. The second stitched the ground inches from his tires. The driver cursed, swerved. Mayne didn't duck. He stood in the Jeep, bracing himself on the roll bar. "I see them!" He opened up with a Vickers gun mounted at hip height, the recoil hammering his arms. The bullets chewed through the sandbags like they were soft clay. The nest went silent. He sat back down, unfazed, brushing sand from his uniform as if annoyed at the inconvenience. This was the man who would eventually destroy over 100 enemy aircraft on the ground, not because he chased numbers, but because he operated with a level of controlled violence the SAS had never seen before and has rarely seen since. The airfield behind them was now a burning inferno. The flames stretched for hundreds of meters. The heat shimmered, fuel tanks detonated in rolling waves, the entire desert sky glowed orange. "Paddy," one of his sergeants called out, "we have to exfil now." Mayne didn't answer at first. He stared at the destruction, the long line of shattered fighters, the charred remains of bombers, the smoking crater where a hangar once stood. Then he gave a short nod. "Right, mount up, lads." They sped back into the desert, swallowed by darkness before German reinforcements could regroup. No medals, no crowds, no headlines, just the sound of cooling metal behind them and the knowledge that tomorrow fewer Luftwaffe planes would take off to kill Allied troops. The desert swallowed the sound of their retreat long before the flames behind them began to die. Hours later, when the SAS column finally halted to refuel under a moonless sky, the men leaned back in their seats, shoulders trembling from adrenaline. Paddy Mayne didn't sit. He paced in silence, boots sinking into the cold sand, hands still blackened with soot, hair whipped by the desert wind. It wasn't victory he was thinking about. It was opportunity, because this raid wasn't a miracle. It was a blueprint, a way to dismantle the Axis war machine not by confronting it head-on, but by slipping behind its lines, killing what mattered, and disappearing before anyone understood what had happened. And that idea didn't come from Mayne alone. It came from a man just as reckless, just as ambitious. David Stirling, the founder of the Special Air Service. Months earlier, Stirling had walked into Mayne's prison tent in Egypt, because at the time, the brilliant Irish officer had been locked up for punching a superior. It wasn't uncommon for Paddy. He was a soldier carved out of contradictions, champion athlete, gifted leader, violent temper, iron loyalty, vicious efficiency. Stirling had stared at him through the bars. "You want revenge?" he asked quietly. "For your men killed at Derna?" Mayne's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "Then stop rotting in a cage," Stirling continued. "I need men who don't break, men the enemy can't predict, men like you." Mayne stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" Sterling smiled a little. "Break the rules." It was the only recruitment pitch Paddy ever needed. By late 1941, the SAS existed only on paper. A handful of volunteers, no vehicles, no doctrine, no respect from the conventional army. They were seen as lunatics, men who crawled into the desert to blow things up with homemade charges. But Sterling didn't care. He saw something the generals didn't: the vast, vulnerable belly of the Axis forces across North Africa, airfields spaced hundreds of miles apart, fuel depots barely guarded, supply convoys moving through predictable routes, and all of it sitting in the open desert just waiting for someone bold enough to strike. Paddy Mayne was that someone. The first time he blew up an aircraft, it wasn't with a Jeep-mounted gun. It was with his bare hands, a pair of pliers, and a satchel charge. He crept through the dark like a shadow, stepping between parked planes, cutting the wires on a Junkers bomber so its alarm wouldn't sound. He ran one hand along the fuselage, feeling its cold metal like a butcher inspecting a carcass. Then he planted his charge beneath the engine block. He didn't run. He walked away, calm, steady. And seconds later, the bomber erupted in a fireball that lit the entire airstrip. But Paddy wasn't looking at the explosion. He was looking at the next plane. By dawn, 14 aircraft were burning. His commanding officer tried to recommend him for a medal. Mayne refused. "Save it," he said. "We're not done yet." And they weren't. Night after night, the SAS returned to the dark. Through sandstorms, through minefields, through blistering heat that melted the soles of their boots. Mayne adapted their tactics constantly. Sometimes they crawled in on foot, faces smeared with engine grease, charges strapped across their chests. Sometimes they drove in with jeeps, Vickers guns mounted at every angle, creating a storm of lead so fierce that Luftwaffe crews ran without even firing back. One night, Mayne destroyed 28 aircraft alone, a record that stunned even his own unit. Another night, he entered a hangar by himself, killed the guards with a knife, and methodically placed charges on each of the 6 aircraft inside, walking out just as the roof blew upward in a geyser of flame. He never bragged, never boasted. When the unit's journal keeper asked him for the exact number of planes he'd destroyed on one raid, Mayne just shrugged. Enough. But SAS records and German reports told the truth. Over 100 aircraft destroyed by Paddy Mayne's own hands. Not with bombs dropped from above, not with artillery from miles away, but face to face, boots on the tarmac, in the dead of night. The Axis command couldn't understand it. How were these aircraft, guarded, hidden, spaced apart, being neutralized at such scale? How were these raiders slipping through their defenses? How were they disappearing across the desert like ghosts? One German officer wrote in frustration, "Whoever leads these British commandos, he has the devil's luck." But it wasn't luck. It was Paddy Mayne. A man who refused to fight the war by the rules. A man who believed that the enemy's aircraft were not symbols, but targets. And the desert was his hunting ground. North Africa was only the beginning. By 1943, the SAS had become a precision weapon, and Paddy Mayne was the blade's sharpened edge. But he wasn't just the most aggressive raider. He was the one who returned from missions no one else should have survived. One night near Bars, Mayne led a squad across 20 miles of hostile ground. The plan was simple: blow up as many aircraft as possible and disappear before sunrise. But nothing in war stays simple. A sandstorm rolled in early, blinding, suffocating, turning the desert into a living wall. The compasses jammed. Visibility dropped to the length of an outstretched arm. Most commanders would have aborted. Paddy didn't even slow down. "Stay tight," he shouted through the wind. "That storm hides us as much as them." They marched into zero visibility, faces pelted with flying sand, rifles wrapped in cloth to prevent clogging. When the storm finally broke, they were right where they needed to be, 50 meters from a row of Italian bombers. It was impossible. It was insane. It was pure Paddy Mayne. They destroyed 22 aircraft that night. Not one man lost. After the raid, an officer wrote in his report, Mayne appears to possess an internal compass of unshakable accuracy. Then added in pencil, or he is simply mad. Both statements were true. By late 43, Mayne's reputation had grown beyond the desert. New recruits whispered about him like a legend, the man who charged machine gun nests alone, the man who planted explosives with perfect calm under the noses of sleeping pilots, the man who would rather die under enemy fire than abandon a wounded comrade. But these stories weren't exaggerations. One night at Tammet Airfield, during yet another aircraft raid, a young SAS trooper was hit by shrapnel and dropped to the tarmac. German guards were closing in fast. Mayne didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He ran back through open fire, lifted the wounded man over his shoulder, and sprinted out while bullets snapped past him. The trooper survived. Mayne earned nothing for it. He never put himself in for medals. His men understood why. For Paddy, awards meant nothing. Your loyalty was measured by what you did when no one was watching. As the war shifted from Africa to Europe, SAS tactics evolved. And Mayne evolved with them. Gone were the days of wide-open desert raids. Now came the hard missions. Deep reconnaissance in Italy. Sabotage in France before D-Day. Hunting columns in the forests of Germany. Here, stealth mattered more than speed. Quiet kills mattered more than explosions. But Paddy Mayne didn't lose his edge. He sharpened it. In Italy, during one of his first missions in mountainous terrain, a German patrol unexpectedly stumbled onto his team's position. There was no time to lay explosives, no time to reposition. Mayne lunged forward, grabbed the nearest German soldier by the collar, and dragged him behind a rock. Before the man could shout, Paddy dropped him with a silent, brutal efficiency that chilled even his own men. The rest of the patrol never knew how close they had come. Afterward, one of the younger SAS troopers asked him quietly, "Sir, how did you stay so calm?" Mayne cleaned his knife, shrugged, and said, "If you panic, you die. If you think, you win." It wasn't bravado. It was his operating system. France was where his legend grew even darker and even more awe-inspiring. Tasked with crippling German supply lines ahead of D-Day, Mayne led small teams behind enemy lines for weeks at a time. They slept in barns, in woods, in ditches, in abandoned cellars. They lived like ghosts among the French hedgerows. At night they struck, ambushing convoys with minimal noise, destroying fuel depots, cutting rail lines, sniping officers from distances that seemed impossible with the weapons of the time. In one operation, Mayne positioned his team near a narrow road lined by stone walls. A German convoy approached, trucks, fuel tankers, and a single armored car. Mayne held up his fist. His men froze. Then, at exactly the right moment, he whispered, "Now." The ambush unfolded like a trapdoor beneath the convoy. Grenades, burst fire, explosives planted on the tanks. In less than 90 seconds, the entire column was in flames. The flames reflected in Mayne's eyes like twin torches. To the Germans, these were not soldiers. They were something more primal. One enemy officer wrote, "This SAS fights with the unpredictability of barbarians and the precision of surgeons." He was describing Mayne, but behind the ruthlessness was something else, something his men rarely spoke about. Paddy Mayne carried every loss personally. If one of his men didn't return, he didn't sleep. He drank, he walked, he sometimes punched walls until his knuckles bled. Because the SAS wasn't just a unit to him, it was his family, his responsibility, his burden. And with every raid, every explosion, every aircraft destroyed on the ground, that burden grew heavier. He never complained, never flinched. But his men saw it, the weight, the guilt, the fury, and the fire. By late 1944, the war had changed shape. The open deserts of North Africa were long behind them. Now the SAS moved through Europe like silent predators, weaving through forests, snow-choked villages, and enemy territory that seemed to twist in on itself like a trap. And yet, this environment didn't slow Paddy Mayne. It made him more dangerous. Because here, surrounded by trees and shadows instead of sand and moonlight, he could do the one thing he excelled at above all: hunt. In Alsace, during a freezing December night, Mayne led a patrol deep behind German lines. Their objective: destroy a supply depot and link up with a French resistance cell. They moved like wolves through the forest, no sound except snow crunching under boots, no light except the faint glow of distant artillery. Halfway to the target, they spotted it, a German half-track convoy, 6 vehicles, headlights dimmed, heading down a narrow farm road. A perfect target. Mayne raised his fist. His men melted into the ditches. He waited. Waited until the lead half-track was almost beside him, so close he could smell the diesel and sweat of the crew. Then he stepped out of the shadows. In one motion he grabbed the driver by the collar, yanked him out of the cab, and slit his throat before the man could scream. The half-track swerved and toppled into a ditch. Mayne's men opened fire. Tracers flashed. Shouts echoed across the frozen fields. 2 minutes later the fight was over. 6 vehicles were burning, supplies scattered across the road. And Mayne was already moving again. "Don't stand still," he ordered. "Standing still gets you killed." They pushed on toward the depot. The raid was textbook Mayne. Silent approach, brutal precision, total destruction. He slipped through the perimeter alone, counting guards in the dark, reading the gaps in their patrol pattern like sheet music. Then he returned to his men and divided them into teams. 2 on the fuel, 2 on the ammo. I'll take the trucks. One of his sergeants blinked. "The trucks, sir? Alone?" Mayne shrugged. "They're not going to blow themselves up." Minutes later, 3 trucks were burning so brightly that even German artillery crews miles away saw the glow. The explosion from the ammunition dump shook pine needles from the trees 100 yards out. The entire German front in that sector choked for days. But it was in Germany, in the dark, collapsing remains of the Third Reich, that Paddy Mayne performed the action many historians still call the single greatest SAS ground rescue of the war. January 1945, near Oldenburg. A forward reconnaissance troop, 12 men, had been ambushed and pinned down inside a farmhouse, surrounded by German infantry with machine guns, mortars, and armored cars. Escape was impossible. Reinforcements were too far. The Germans were tightening the noose by the minute, and then, through the blizzard, they heard engines. SAS jeeps, 4 of them. At their head, standing upright behind a Vickers gun, coat whipping in the wind, was Paddy Mayne. He didn't slow. He didn't hesitate. He drove straight into the German kill zone. Bullets hammered the jeeps. Machine guns tore up the snow around their wheels. Mortars shook the ground. Mayne's response was a wall of fire from twin Vickers guns, stitching the enemy positions in long, savage bursts. He turned his jeep sideways, skidding to a stop in front of the pinned farmhouse, using the vehicle as a shield. "Everyone out!" he roared. The trapped troopers sprinted through the doorway, ducking low, diving behind the jeeps as explosions ripped apart the walls behind them. Mayne stood tall in the open, firing with both hands, something no one else would have dared in that storm of lead. He didn't step back until the last man was safe. Then he jumped behind the wheel, gunned the engine, and led the entire convoy out the way he'd come. Through the fire, through the blizzard, through the German lines that never understood what hit them. 12 men lived. Because of one. A British officer who witnessed the aftermath wrote, "No ordinary courage was shown here. This was something closer to myth." Mayne's commanding officers submitted him for the Victoria Cross, the highest honor in the British military. But bureaucracy, politics, jealousy. Whatever the reasons, the VC was denied. His men were furious. Senior officers protested. Even in the modern era, military historians still argue it was one of the greatest injustices of WWII. But Mayne never complained, never demanded recognition. When one of his troopers apologized, as if the failure of command was somehow their guilt, Mayne simply said, "I didn't do it for medals. I did it because there are men." Then he walked away, quiet, heavy, unshaken. But the war wasn't done with him yet, not by a long shot. And somewhere deep inside, Paddy Mayne knew the darkness he carried, the violence he had mastered, wasn't finished either. The deeper the SAS pushed into Germany, the more brutal the fighting became. Towns were half ruins, half fortresses. Roads were mined, bridges blown, forests filled with Volkssturm, SS remnants, and units too desperate and too fanatical to surrender. But Paddy Mayne thrived in the chaos, not because he enjoyed killing, not because he believed in glory, but because he understood one truth better than any officer around him. SAS was built for the places where logic ended. In March 1945, Mayne was promoted to acting lieutenant colonel and tasked with leading 1st SAS Regiment on deep penetration raids across northern Germany. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He just asked one question: when do we move? The answer came quickly. A German command post had been identified in the countryside, a hub coordinating counterattacks against advancing British and Canadian units. Hit that nerve center, and entire German formations would collapse. But the approach was suicide. Kilometers of open fields, no cover, guard towers with MG-42s, patrols every hour. A conventional unit wouldn't stand a chance. Mayne studied the map, took a breath, and said, "We go at night, in small teams, fast and quiet." A major shook his head. "Colonel, you'll be walking straight into overlapping machine gun lines." Mayne glanced up with tired eyes that no longer held any fear. "Only if they see us." They moved under a moon that barely broke through the clouds. 12 men, faces blackened, weapons wrapped to muffle sound. For 2 kilometers they crawled, inch by inch, through wet grass and mud that soaked their uniforms and froze their bones. Every time a spotlight swept near, they pressed into the earth, breath held until ribs ached. At 60 meters, they split. 4 men peeled left, 4 right. Mayne moved straight ahead, alone. He navigated between 2 guard posts, timing each step with the rhythm of boots above him. Every sound was a kill switch. Every shadow concealed a rifle. When he reached the command barracks, he didn't stop to think. He kicked the door open, a flash of shock on the German officers' faces. And then he opened fire. Precise, controlled, efficient. The room fell silent in less than 10 seconds. By the time the guards outside understood what was happening, it was too late. Explosions began erupting across the camp as the other SAS teams set charges on vehicles, radio trucks, and ammunition. A fuel truck went up next, lighting the entire night sky in a violent orange bloom. Mayne ran through the chaos, shouting for withdrawal. "Move! Move! Move!" Tracer fire tore across the field as they fled. Mortars pounded the ground behind them. German voices shouted in panic and rage. An SAS trooper stumbled, his leg hit by shrapnel. Mayne didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man under one arm and dragged him through the mud with terrifying strength. "Get up! You're not dying here!" Bullets snapped overhead. Dirt sprayed their faces. Something exploded so close that it knocked them both sideways. Mayne shielded the wounded soldier with his own body until the shockwave passed, then forced himself to his feet and hauled the man onward. They crossed into the tree line seconds before the German machine guns found their range. Not one SAS operator died that night, but an entire German command network collapsed. The next day, field reports poured in. Coordinated artillery, gone, counterattacks, falling apart, German retreats, uncontrolled. Mayne's raid didn't just destroy a headquarters, it shattered the last organized resistance in that sector. An officer told him, "You broke their spine." Mayne just stared at the ground and said quietly, "They'll replace it." Because even victory tasted bitter to him now. Too many losses behind him, too many ghosts in his wake. He drank more, slept less, spoke rarely. But when orders came, he moved with the same ruthless clarity as always. It wasn't heroism, it was momentum. A man pushed by the war as much as he pushed back against it. By April 1945, the SAS was performing not just raids, but liberation missions, and these changed him more than destruction ever did. In one German village, Mayne led a patrol into a schoolhouse being used as a temporary prison. Inside, dozens of civilians, starved, terrified, huddled together in silence. When they saw the red berets, they cried. One old man kissed Paddy's hand. A little girl tried to give him a wilted flower. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd spent years destroying, years killing, years turning himself into something sharp and unforgiving. But here, in a quiet room that smelled of dust and damp paper, people looked at him like he was a savior. It unsettled him more than enemy fire ever had. After the mission, he walked outside alone and stood at the edge of the village, staring at nothing for a long time. War had carved him into a weapon, but moments like this forced him to remember he was still human. And being human hurt. He pushed forward anyway, because Germany was collapsing. The Allied lines were moving faster every day, and Paddy Mayne believed that until the guns stopped firing, his job wasn't finished. Not while there were still people to rescue. Not while German units still held prisoners. Not while the war still had teeth. And the war, even in its death throes, still had plenty. By late April 1945, the war was breathing its last, but it wasn't dying gently. Germany was fractured into pockets of resistance, some terrified, some fanatical, all unpredictable. SAS patrols pushed deeper each day, following shattered roads, burned-out villages, and retreating Wehrmacht units that fought with the desperation of a collapsing nation. Paddy Mayne rode in the lead jeep of 1st SS Regiment, one hand on the Vickers K, coat flapping in the cold spring wind, eyes locked on the horizon like he was staring into the war's heart. His men didn't ask if he was tired. They knew he was. Everyone was. But when Paddy stood at the front of a column, he gave off the illusion of a man carved from something other than flesh. Bone, stone, will, something unbreakable. On April 9, 1945, just outside the German town of Oldenburg, the radios exploded with panic. A Canadian advance reconnaissance troop, 12 men, had been ambushed while crossing open farmland. German machine guns locked them into a stone barn. Mortars were walking in closer with every minute. They were outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from reinforcement, and they weren't going to survive another half hour. Except one person heard the call. One person who didn't wait for orders. Paddy. He turned to his men. "Mount up, we're going." The sergeant blinked. "Sir, that area is crawling with—" "Mount. Up." It wasn't a suggestion. They tore across German farmland, engines screaming, mud and grass flying from the tires. Mayne pushed the jeeps so hard the engines whined like animals being driven past their limits. As they crested a low hill, the battlefield emerged, a scene of chaos framed by smoke and burning farm buildings. German armored cars ringed the barn, pouring fire into the stone walls. Machine gun nests sprayed every window. Infantry moved in squads, leapfrogging forward, tightening the noose. And inside, 12 men were fighting to live the next 60 seconds. Mayne didn't slow. He stood up, full height, exposed, defying every rule of combat, and grabbed the Vickers gun with both hands. "Drive straight in," he shouted. His men stared, but the drivers obeyed. 4 SAS jeeps burst down the slope like a stampede of steel, engines roaring, guns blazing. German soldiers froze for a heartbeat, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Who attacks into a kill zone? Who stands tall on a jeep silhouetted against tracer fire? Who forces a fight at point-blank range against superior numbers? Paddy Mayne. Only Paddy Mayne. The Vickers K gun roared in his hands like a living thing. 200 rounds per second tore into German positions, shredding sandbags, ripping through mortar crews, cutting down machine gunners before they could pivot their barrels. A German armored car swung its turret toward the jeeps. But Mayne was faster. He sprayed the vision ports, blinding the driver, then raked the tires until they came apart. The armored car lurched sideways and slammed into a tree. Mortar shells burst around the SS column, showers of earth and shrapnel exploding against their coats. Someone shouted, "Paddy, get down! You're exposed!" He didn't even hear them. He was already firing at the next target. They skidded to a stop beside the battered stone barn. Mayne jumped off the jeep, sprinting through open fire like a man immune to bullets. He kicked the barn door open with a boot that cracked the wood. Inside, smoke, dust, blood, fear. The Canadians stared at him in shock. One corporal whispered, "Jesus, it's him!" Mayne grabbed the nearest wounded soldier, threw the man's arm over his shoulder, and dragged him out the doorway in one brutal motion. "Move, on your feet, let's go." Another Canadian hesitated. "We can't, we're surrounded." Mayne's voice boomed, "Not anymore." Outside, the other SAS jeeps poured fire into the German line, ripping open a corridor where seconds ago there had been nothing but steel and death. One by one, the Canadians limped, crawled, or were carried to safety, all under Mayne's covering fire. A bullet grazed his ear. Another tore through his sleeve. Shrapnel peppered the jeep beside him. He didn't stop, not until the last man had reached the jeeps, not until he had personally hauled 2 wounded soldiers across 50 meters of open ground. Only then did he dive into the passenger seat. "Go!" The SAS convoy blasted back through the same gap they had carved, engines screaming, mortars exploding behind them. Not one of the 12 Canadians died. Not one SAS trooper fell. And the Germans never understood how the impossible had just happened. That rescue became the core of the recommendation for Paddy Mayne's Victoria Cross, a medal he deserved by every definition of courage and leadership. But politics, following a long war of bending rules and challenging authority, left him denied. His men were furious. Canadian officers were furious. Even high-ranking British generals protested. Paddy? He said only, "They'd have done the same for us." Then he walked off, quietly, as if dragging 12 men out of hell was just another night at work. But the war wasn't over, not quite yet. And Paddy Mayne had one more chapter before the guns finally fell silent, a chapter where the man who had destroyed over 100 aircraft, shattered countless enemy supply lines, rescued men from impossible odds, and led SAS into legend, would confront something even he could not shoot, stab, or outrun. Germany collapsed in May of 1945. Towns surrendered. Weapons dropped into ditches. Columns of defeated soldiers marched west with blank faces and empty hands. For most, this was the moment relief finally arrived. For Paddy Mayne, it was the first moment he had time to feel. He wasn't built for peace. His entire identity, everything sharpened, hardened, perfected over years, was forged in fire and violence. And suddenly the guns stopped. The night raids stopped. The ambushes stopped. The missions where every breath could be the last stopped. He stood at the edge of a German airfield one evening, looking at the rows of captured aircraft. He had spent the war destroying these things by the dozen, slipping in at night, planting charges, turning them into burning craters. Now they just sat there, silent, harmless, useless. His men approached quietly. "Sir," one of them said, "we're shipping home soon." Mayne nodded. "Good?" A long pause. "You did everything anyone could have asked," the trooper added. Mayne didn't answer, because deep down he didn't believe it. He carried every death, every failure, every moment he survived when someone else didn't. He lived through the war, but the war lived inside him too. When the SAS was officially disbanded in October 1945, Paddy Mayne stood in front of his regiment for the last time. He looked at the men who had followed him into deserts, forests, cities, hell itself. Men he had fought beside, men he had saved, men he had buried. He wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the history they'd carved together. But all that came out was, "You were the finest men I ever knew." It was enough, because coming from him, those words meant more than any medal. He returned home to Northern Ireland a different man. He tried to go back to rugby, tried to work as a lawyer, tried to live quietly. But the war had imprinted itself on him. Nightmares, insomnia, drinking that turned from habit to refuge, a restlessness that could never be satisfied. People knew he was a hero, but few knew the cost. The man who had been fearless in battle now fought enemies no one else could see. And unlike in Germany, unlike in North Africa, this time he fought alone. On December 14, 1955, at the age of 40, Robert Blair Paddy Mayne died in a car accident. The official report said it was caused by fatigue. His friends knew better. The war that hadn't killed him on the battlefield had followed him home. At his funeral, SAS veterans stood in silence, berets tucked beneath their arms, eyes forward, backs straight. They weren't mourning just a commander. They were mourning the man who had dragged them from fire, who had turned impossible missions into routine victories, who had destroyed over 100 aircraft with his own hands, who had led from the front every time, who had lived like a storm and burned like a star. The chaplain read the final words. A simple line, but perfect. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And in that moment, every man present knew Paddy Mayne had done that long before the day he died. He gave pieces of himself away on every battlefield, in every night raid, in every rescue, in every act of impossible courage, until there was nothing left for peace to save. Today, historians still debate medals, still argue he was wrongfully denied the Victoria Cross, still dissect the operations that made SS the stuff of legend. But among those who know, among soldiers, special forces, operators, and anyone who's ever studied courage, there is no debate at all. Paddy Mayne was one of the greatest warriors the modern world has ever produced. Not because of how many he killed, not because of how much he destroyed, but because when men were lost, surrounded, dying, he went in after them, every single time.